So without further ado, Jonathan's on and go for it. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Yeah, my name is Johnathan Morell. I'm due to graduate this semester, and
He's with the group.
37 AE, so just figure out wherever you are and subtract a few. Yeah, so this is my presentation, Jesus, Masculinities. And so what I'd like to do first is a little bit of audience, verbal participation. You can do wherever you're sitting. I want to just talk a little bit about, or get your feedback, get some suggestions sort of just off the top of your head. When you think about sort of the constructs about masculinity, so like men should, men are, like what are some of the words that just pop in your head? Tough.
Potency.
Don't cry.
Beard.
Strong.
Proper.
Rational.
Powerful. Assertive.
In control.
Great. And then on this side, I want to construct a similar kind of suggestions about what do you think evangelical? What are the expectations of evangelical? What are some of the they could be the same, they could be different. Like what are your
Stoic.
Stellar?
Stoic.
Stoic.
Emotive?
Emotive?
So, Jonathan, I'm sorry. Was your question what are our expectations of evangelical men?
So yeah, like maybe not your personal, but within the evangelical community, what do you think are the
Within
so just like we're sort of
Okay.
part of this, yeah. So from your own, maybe just your own perception. What are your own perception?
Sure.
Sure.
Patriarchal.
Think of lively, kind of like energetic. Is that true?
I think communal, kind of community oriented.
Decision maker.
Provider.
Great. And just by show of hands, and we'll get into this in a second, but who has some experience either growing up or has some experience in an evangelical community? Great, thanks. So basically, what I want to use these two ideas is basically to sort of illustrate kind of a pool that men swim in. So we've got kind of a larger culture and society, and so this is kind of the water, if you will. This is kind of like in the water, of the masculine water, if you will, of the experiences that men are having, both sort of in culture and society, and also within evangelical communities, and we will come back to these. So these are my research questions. The first was, what are the subjective masculine experiences for white evangelical college men? And I'll get into a little bit more what that subjective masculine experiences is. And then what, if any, is the connection of their experiences to strengths? And then the last one is, are these experiences different from the population at large? Their peers sort of outside of evangelical communities. And so some of my research goals had a lot to do with kind of, and I think in a lot of social science research, a lot of that early research was done on men, by men, for everyone, right? It was sort of overgeneralized, like this is a research study with a bunch of white guys, and then we're going to say that they're everybody. So we kind of fast forward through time, we've gotten a little bit more accurate and more aware of some of our shortcomings in the recent social science research. And so we've included voices that have been eliminated, that were marginalized. And so white men haven't really been studied as white guys for a while. They were everybody. They were students. they were everybody. And so what I'd like to consider is offering data on a really often privileged subset of American society, and even within religious groups and often privileged religious community. And so to sort of being able to describe them in their own words, and being able to have a set of data that reflects some of their own ideas about themselves. And then also sort of there's an action part of this research, which is I want to give them an opportunity, the men that represent this case study that they represent, an opportunity to critique their own definitions of masculinity by hearing from other native speakers, if you will, other people that are part of their group. And then also hopefully that'll create awareness opportunities to partner with women in dismantling patriarchal systems. So there's a real activist component to my research that I hope that comes as a result. So what I want to start with is just these are sort of the emerging themes, and I'll get into how I got these, but I just want to kind of give you this up front. Also, what you have, so responsibility, family provider. These were the top salient themes in the survey and interview data that I gathered. And so the thing that you have in your hand is a list of the dimensions that I surveyed for. And so you can kind of see the family and responsibility there are definitions. So working left to right, there's the dimension name. There's the definition of that dimension, sort of what is described in that dimension. There is an example from my study. So this is words from the men in my study. And then there is a number, and that's the number of responses I got for that particular dimension in that percentage. The percentage of the total responses. To give you a little orientation of that. So I will be referring back to this, but as I talk about these different dimensions, family, responsibility, work, whatever they might be, just to look down at those and kind of see what I'm talking about will kind of help with some of the definitions. What I also found was that stress was frequently present for a lot of these men, and I'll drill down to that a little bit more. And so much so that family provider had the highest stress content, the highest stress scores, and emotional toughness was a close second. And I'll get into those in a second. So part of the lens that I'm working with on this particular study comes from Kimmel and Mesner here. They talk about the important fact of men's lives is not that they're biological males, but that they grow up to become men. And so our sex may be male, but our identity as men is developed through a complex series of processes, interaction with culture in which we learn the gender scripts appropriate to our culture and attempt to modify those scripts to make them more palatable. And so I'm curious, as evangelical men work with these gender scripts, and as they try to make them more palatable, does that generate more stress in their lives? So that's what I'm trying to tap into. I wanted to introduce the gender-bred person. If you haven't seen this. So this is from Killerman in his book, A Social Justice Reader, and so there's a number of ways we kind of express our gender, and some of those are in identity, attraction, in our biological sex, and then also in our expression. And so what I'm trying to tap into is this expression piece. So the way that we present ourselves to the world that we live in, but this expression is also sort of the air that surrounds the gender-bred person. And so it's also sort of, like I said, the water that they swim in. So this is kind of what I'm trying to access. And these things are all so interconnected, it's going to be really difficult to not tug on one without the other one sort of also being connected. So all of these things are involved, and I'm trying to hyper-focus on this expression piece. And so some of the past research, I just want to touch on some of the things that other researchers have been doing. And if you're interested in more of this, the research is basically called the Psychology of Men, or Men and Masculinities. And so a lot of those studies have found that there's a relationship between sort of adhering to these concepts, whatever these might be, sort of the dominant masculine ideals within a society, and oftentimes there's a connection or relationship depression, increased psychological distress, use of alcohol, binge drinking and drugs, loneliness, low motivation for help seeking, that's both mental health and medical health, and then a higher propensity to engage in high-risk behavior. In this particular study, they were talking about men that were playing hurt in athletics. So a lot, really prevalent in this study, in this particular study, which was considered a high-risk behavior. And so I also want to just introduce evangelicals a little bit and give you just an idea. This is really broad strokes, but evangelicals define themselves in a lot of ways. And so even the term evangelical is sort of hard to nail down. A lot of researchers disagree as to what or who is evangelical. And so a lot of evangelicals have their own personal definition of what that means for them. And so some researchers are going to say fundamentalists are the exact same as evangelicals, but the evangelicals that we're dealing with sort of in 2014 that are living in our communities, they're actually part of this movement called the New Evangelical Movement that came around in 2000 or right after World War II, and their attempt was to distance themselves from fundamentalism. Now, whether we're closer to that or further than that now, that's up for debate. But the reality is that this new evangelical movement, their biggest drive was to engage socially and politically, or engage their faith socially and politically. So we've seen that played out in a variety of contexts. Another piece about the evangelicals theologically, there's these concepts that are important to them. Cruciocentrism, which is basically like the act of Christ's sacrifice on the cross is of critical importance to my faith. Like that's a deal breaker. Like if that didn't happen, that's sort of like the rest of it doesn't really matter. That's a really big important piece for them. Another piece is activism, and so this is like a faith that's lived out through effort, which has some really great things and some really challenging things as well. And then also this last piece is called biblicism, or a high regard for literal reading of sacred texts. In this case, the Bible. And then this other piece is also Protestants. There's like a religious evangelical or a cultural evangelicalism, where evangelicals identify based on the schools they send their kids to, the organizations that they support, the causes that they support, and the churches that they attend. And so it's not just that I have these strict beliefs about my faith, but I also am sort of part of the community of evangelicalism, whatever that is, and that can be different for a lot of for many people. So just a couple things about my approach, my philosophy. I started with a phenomenological approach, and essentially phenomenology is about the lived experience. So I'm trying to get as close as possible to the people that are having the experience that I want to get to know more. And so the experience that I'm interested in, the phenomenon that I'm interested in, is the masculinity of white evangelical college men. And so rather than talking to their parents or their professors, I want to get in a room with them. I want to talk about what their experiences are and how that affects them. So that was partly why I chose phenomenology, is because it's highly experiential and it's highly individual, and it takes each person's story as valid. It is true, and it doesn't necessarily invalidate someone else's. So that was also something that was important for me. And then basically, as a researcher, I'm trying to distill all that information down to determine essences. And so I'm trying to come up with some sort of idea of what is the essence of a white evangelical college male's experience in 2014. What does that look like? So it's kind of a big task. The second approach that I use as part of my philosophy was a social constructivist approach. And so social constructivists basically say that social identity is formed with interactions in between people. And so it's not necessarily that biology is the driving factor for why we are the way we are, or who we choose to be in the world. It's these social interactions that we have, and that's where our social identity comes from. And so things like experience, actions, and perceptions, those are the things that are important to social constructivists. And again, I wanted those to kind of be on the table for me to talk about, to hear about, and to try to distill down into essences, specifically at an experiential level. So the sheet that you have is the information from this survey, the subjective masculinity stress scale. And they had 23 dimensions in their inaugural survey. And what they noted in that survey was that men that had a high stress score on their survey also had high psychological stress. So a high score for a participant with the SMSS also scored high on other psychological tests that tested for psychological distress. And then the thing that they noted, and you can see a comparison between my data and their data, is that family, responsibility, physical body, emotional toughness, and work were their top 5 dimensions. So you can see some overlap between the dimensions that that came from my population and this population, which was way more diverse. And I'll get into that in a second, but they had much more, their age, they had a higher age range, and also a lot more ethnic diversity.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This is the subjective masculine experiences model, and so I'm going to kind of gloss over it a little bit, but basically I'm trying to get to here. I'm trying to understand this. And what I want you to take away from this is that through the social constructivist lens, basically saying that there's an intellectual component to gender meaning making and an experiential component. And so what I'm trying to tap into is that experiential component. I want to know, based on your experiences, not necessarily like, I think I should be like John Wayne, but it's like, I need to be like John Wayne because I've had these experiences, whatever that looks like. So I'm trying to get to into this domain with a lot of working my way further and further in. So the scale that I administered, first of all, I developed a 24th dimension with the with the assistance of the primary author called Faith and Religion. You can see, I think that's the 3rd dimension that came up for that was salient for my population. I had two sections. First was as a man, and so they basically completed the prompt. So they can write as little as much as they want, fill in the blank, basically as a man, and then they finish that sentence, whatever that is. They could do that up to 10 times, and then they were rating the frequency in which that statement was stressful to them based on a 1 to 5 scale. So 1, never, almost never, 5, always, almost always. And then the 3rd component was that they oftentimes had a gender expectation within these statements. And so these are the statements that are like, I have to, I must, I can't not, I'm expected to. So these are like mandatory elements of their masculinity that aren't just, I want to do these or I would love to do these. It's just like, these are absolutes. Like I have to do this sort of in order to belong in the water that I live in, that I swim in. So a couple of things about demographics. 100% of my participants identified as white male, culturally United States American. They grew up in a Christian church in the mean age of 19 and a half years. Here's some denominational information if that's interesting to you. I was sort of looking into tapping into that non-denominational denomination, and if you want to know more about that, we'll talk later. So here's some of my results. So I had 246 responses from 27 participants. The 22 of the 24 dimensions came up in my results. The 2 that did not are phallic competence and risky behavior, which are in the bottom of that second page. 40% of the total responses had a gender expectation, so 60% didn't. So these are the I have to, I can't not, I absolutely have to kind of things. They had an overall mean stress score of 3.27, so that's frequently experience stress based on their dimension, based on these dimensions of masculinity. And then responsibility, family, faith and religion, emotional toughness, and physical body were my top 5. And you can see on from the first dimension, what percentage of responsibility, or what percentage of the responsibility?
Yeah.
So a huge number, right? And then what's the next number down there?
Yeah.
8, right? So a huge amount of what masculinity means to these men is being responsible, leaving a legacy, being accountable. Like these are the messages that they're getting from their community. So again, these are it's kind of a pictorial view of the dimensions. Again, you can see 60. Yeah. So these are I'm just gonna keep going. And then this is sort of a zoom in of the stress scores by themes. And so you can see, I put it on a 1 to 4 scale, even though it's a 1 to 5 scale, just to highlight the differences. And so you can see that emotional toughness is sort of the highest stress score, with faith and religion being the lowest. And so in terms of from high to low, it's emotional toughness, physical body, family, responsibility, and faith and religion where the stress was. And so some of the significant findings from the responsibility, so then I took all the responsibility answers or responses and I analyzed those. And so I had 63 of those, and just over half of them had a gender expectation. So like, I have to be responsible, I have to be accountable, I have to be, some of these other things. And some of those responses were, I must stand up for what is wrong, against what is right when it's wrong. I'm expected to act with courage and strength in all circumstances. And when I compared the two, the gender expectation versus the non-gender expectation, a 1-cell t-test revealed no significant difference. So the stress scores for those two responses were not, the difference was not significant.
Say that again, because that's
So yeah, I took, so the gender expectation, nope, I did not mean to press stop.
Just push that again and it'll come back on.
So yeah, so the gender expectation scores had an average stress score of 3, and then the non-responsibility, non-gender expectation scores had a 3.07. So when I took those two scores and compared them with the 1-cell t-test, they revealed no significant difference. So it means they're essentially, statistically, they're the same. Some significant family findings, again, had an above average, had an above average stress score, but again, a t-test revealed no significant difference between gender expectations. And so, so some of these are like, be a good example to my children, I'm the head of my family, etc. And this is kind of where some of the more interesting findings that I had. And so any family dimension that mentioned being a provider or a leader or head of the family or head of the household, I took all those responses and I came up with a mean stress score, and it was a 4. So that's pretty significant. That's really high. So then I wanted to know, well, what about the rest of the family responses? What's their stress score? And it was a 2.66. So when I analyzed those to see if they're different, and they had a really high significance, or they were statistically different at a high level, where p equals 0.009, and that's a high statistical significance. That when it comes to provider or being the head of the family, like those types of that, the expression of that expectation of masculinity is significantly stressful than the I want to have a family stuff. So that I need to be a provider for my family, that is adding significant stress to the men in my population. I also did 5 interviews as a way to sort of pull out some more data, get some, as a way to kind of triangulate the things from the survey to see if what I was finding was also findable in a survey. So I connected with 5 men, there's a little bit of there. I gave them pseudonyms, which will show up in a second. And I just wanted to provide a couple quotes about their experiences, specifically around responsibility. And so Greg would say that my mother always used to say that failure is not an option all the time growing up. The reason it adds stress is because for me, it's like the end of the world. Like I have to succeed at it, that this success is my only option. And then Edward said, once I got a 96 on a test and would go home, and my parents would say, what 4% did you get wrong? I said that the pressure sometimes was horrible. So this is kind of there is this element of responsibility that is, I think can be positive, but these men are saying that the pressure within my family to be responsible, to be accountable, it's very, very stressful. It's significantly stressful. And then from the family provider quotes, Edward said, I was just constantly told, you do not take a girl on a date and have her pay out. Even if she's your friend, you will pay for it. You will provide. My father believed that you show that from the beginning in dating. So this is something that he grew up with. That this provider dimension is a absolute mandatory part of his expression as a Christian evangelical man. And then Greg said had a different take on it. Said that there's not really a logical reason why a man has to make more money. It should be about what makes him happy. So even amongst my participants, there was a spectrum of beliefs about this particular dimension. And so, kind of to bring it down into focus, essentially this is the masculine water that these guys are swimming in. And so it looks a little bit like responsibility. You have to be responsible. Like you have to take care of the things that you're supposed to take care of. That's just like an absolute. That you should and must provide for your family. Like again, that's not an option. This is something that you have to do it. And that you're also expected to want to have a family, and that you will have a family. And so these are also sort of salient expectations within the evangelical community these guys come from. Also that you don't show your emotions. And so again, kind of going back to that slide where emotional toughness was a stressful and also sort of mandatory part of their expression of masculinity. And then be like Christ, which is sort of an ambiguous idea. And I talked to the men in my group, and the men that I surveyed, and they sort of each had different components of what they felt like Christ was. But that was through the faith and dimension component, that was the responses almost always mentioned something about that. And then being physically strong and athletic. This is came up in our kind of general man box over here, but also is a very prevalent and present pressure for these guys as well, is having a body that exudes athleticism, that exudes power, strength, and toughness. I also wanted to touch on a few limitations of this study. Due to the relatively small nature of my sample size, these aren't necessarily things I'm going to go out and say, like, these are generalizable to all white evangelical college guys. And also it's a case study, and so I specifically narrowed in on these men just to have a better idea of what their experiences are. Another limitation was that the scale that I used didn't actively measure positive stress, rather than just sort of negative stress, so like it didn't measure eustress. So like for example, yeah, my community wants me to be responsible, and that helps me to excel in life, and that helps me to actually do the things that are good for me or good for my community. Didn't really ask that. And then also with the 1 to 5 scale, it sort of assumes that stress is present, and so it didn't have a 0 option where they could say like, I want a family, and that really doesn't add, that adds 0 stress. I also wish I would have asked about socioeconomic status. I definitely had guys that were living in the hills with parents that had BMWs, and then other guys that were from trailer parks, from parents who were dealing drugs. So I had truly the spectrum of socioeconomic experiences, and I wasn't able to kind of capture that in the survey. And then the last thing, I didn't ask if they were in a committed or a single relationship, and I think that would have been interesting for how many of them want a family. And for this generation, they're not getting married until they're 29 for guys. And so potentially these guys have another 10 years and they get to sort of sit with the stress of family, providing for, etc. What's that going to do to their lives? So I wish I would have been able to capture that a little bit more. I was able to do that in the interviews, but not necessarily in the survey. So back to my research questions. Here they are. Here's my references. Happy to send those. There you go. Thank you.
Johnathan, that was wonderful. There's always some questions.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, it's really interesting, and I was just wondering if you had more time, if you were gonna keep going, would you wanna do some comparative sampling, to see how many of these things aren't necessarily faith-based or gender-based?
Yeah, so the Shane Wong, who developed this SMSS, They are working on a women's version of this. I think it's in print right now.
Yeah.
That's happening. But I think you're asking for me specifically.
Yeah, because you've come up with some findings, but I'm just
Yeah.
wondering if you are now, just to kind of strengthen
Yeah.
your
well,
understanding of your population.
I think I'm in Kevin's boat. I only did 1 degree. And so, yeah, I had all the time and
Right.
resources in the world, I'd have done a national survey, I would have done a ethnically diverse, background, I would have had certainly women involved in, but I had to just go with the population that I feel like I don't want them to be pitied in the sense that like, oh, these white guys, like they need support, or I mean they do, but we need to divert resources to these guys. Like that's not what I'm saying. I want them to be understood and not pitied. And that was a big motivation for why I went the direction.
Yeah, it just makes me curious, because some of your findings seem like, now I'm curious, how much does that apply to people who wouldn't identify themselves as being faith-based at all, or,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that Shane Long's initial study that they did take that from a faith population,
Right.
and again they had a lot of crossover. And actually, work, the dimension of work was higher on their findings, but I think that work my population in family, like that's where the I have to have a job so I can provide for family, but it's coming up in the general population in a different way. And so I think maybe this last question, like, are these similar to the population at large? I kind of think that maybe, like if this is sort of the men in society, that it's something like this, that evangelical men sort of exist out here, but also they're here and here. And so they're actually having to do both of these things. And some of these are not compassionate and potent, assertive and pure and emotive. Like they're into, and they want to belong in both worlds. That pressure is absolutely present for them, and they absolutely want to continue to be part of this community too. So, yeah.
Was that specifically your motivation for using faith as a limiting factor on your population? Was it to get a smaller, to deliberately get a smaller sample size, or was it specifically because you recognize these kind of competing stressors?
I don't think that the competition of stressors came out as much as in my initial thoughts.
Right.
But it definitely came out as I went on.
Sure.
And even like a lot of research that's out there that says sort of like participation in traditional religion is largely a feminine activity. And then even like survey numbers about who attends church is majority women. But who leads those churches? It's weird, right? It's all men, largely. And so there's obviously some disconnect there as well. So engaging in what is considered like an emotive, compassionate, charismatic, religious experience, and also existing that human experience, tension in their lives. And I think that partly I chose them because I have such easy access to them as well.
I was curious, just to clarify something for me, but when you said that some of the responses had gender expectations in the should, I was just curious, what were responses that didn't have gender expectations tied to them?
Some of the responses on there, let's say I want a family. That would be that's not a gender expectation. Or have a job once I graduate from college.
I need to be earning a wage. Yeah. Exactly.
I need to be earning a wage. Yeah. Need. Good question, Kevin.
Tell me about like relevance for your study. I like the academic because in this you can't go wrong with that. More about where can we use this data and information?
Yeah. So part of my practicum, I worked with an organization called White Male Diversity Partners. So they're based in Portland, so it worked out for me to intern there basically. And so it's an organization, non-faith-based organization that has both men and women of color working and white men and women working for this organization. Their focus is corporate integration of gender, basically for the elimination of sexism, racism, and homophobia. And And so I did my internship with them, and I was able to participate in a week-long intensive that they do for sort of like your middle to upper managers in an organization, and it was awesome. But the interesting thing was it was all white guys. I was the youngest guy by probably about 15 years, and so these are like the generation that came sort of like through the 60s, through
You're 10 years away from retiring.
yeah, potentially maybe 15, 20 years, maybe yeah. But yeah, there was so it was really fascinating to see the facilitators work them through some concepts that were very new to them, and that they had a lot of resistance to it. And what was kind of neat about it was that the facilitators kind of recognized that this is a topic that was difficult for them, and they embraced the idea that they had some scar tissue around it. Whether that's reasonable scar tissue or not.
It seems like it's like a kind of a generation gap. Because for the younger generation,
There were men in that room though that were absolutely on board that were in there. They like, yeah, I'm here. And actually, there were some guys from the UK that were there that were like, yeah, we did this 20 years ago. So even the United States is sort of situated globally in a really unique place. So where was one of that?
No,
I
you
have,
answered it. No,
I have, well,
the applicability.
yeah, and I did a 2-year program with some of the men at the college that I work with. It was all white guys, and so we basically talked about this concept of race and homophobia and sexism, and helping them work through these concepts. And in large part, these are blind spots that get reinforced because of the communities that they grow up in. And so helping them bring down those blind spots, analyze it, help them be engaged, figure out where they can partner, and eventually dismantle the systems, basically.
I'm just wondering, again, your sample size was looking at college men. Now I'm almost, it would be great. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking, what to do with
Writing my PhD.
No, well now, I mean, first of all, I have a couple thoughts. First of all, how the downturn of 2008 sort of affected some of these families where now maybe women are the head of the household and what the backlash that has on the men in those families. But I'm also wondering if these criteria end up being good indicators of satisfaction, life happiness, marital success rates, for the men who kind of felt these same stresses as 19-year-olds and now they're 4-year-olds.
Absolutely, yeah. Michael Kimball's just come out with a really great book called Angry White Man. You should check it out. It's not necessarily it's not a longitudinal study. It's phenomenal longitude-based survey data and interviews. And he's basically went all around the nation, talked to groups of largely white guys, largely angry white guys, and sort of getting at a little bit of that life satisfaction.
One more question. Maybe two.
I was going to ask you, Johnathan, part of one of your questions was that like activist days, like what do we do with this and how do we create more equality, diversity? And I'm just curious, just to speak towards how, like, did you find yourself after doing this kind of research, doing this work, focusing in on like what it means to be a very specific kind of white man, not just like white? How did that affect either your students' interactions with people of color or minorities or women or whatever? Like, did you notice like differences in your students or yourself? Or was that just?
Yeah. I think what I've learned is that this is a very complex process. It's a very complex system, and that men that are going to engage in this process have to do it sustainably. Because I think burnout is a huge part of this. What I'm getting at is I'm not sure that I will necessarily see benefits of this in the short run, but it will be in the long run in their ability to have these kinds of conversations around race, around gender, around heterosexuality, around these concepts that a large part they feel sort of like I can't contribute to this because I don't have a gender, I don't have a race, I don't have a sexuality, which I think is crazy, right? And so if they can have those conversations in their workplace, in their organization, at their church, whatever that is, then I think that makes them better leaders, because the opposite of that is just them saying that it doesn't exist and I can't touch it. So yeah, I don't know that I'll necessarily see that, but that's kind of what I would.
We need to thank Johnathan once more. And that excellent presentation, and Jonathan has done excellent work. Again, I know for those of you in various stages of your studies, it's really challenging to be swimming and thinking of what am I going to do, what is it that I will focus on. But Jonathan has done an excellent job. I also want to reinforce that the study that Jonathan did, we often look at the limitations, like it was a small population, I can't generalize. That is exactly the first step, which is wonderful to do with a master's degree, because it's almost like, one, it's a pilot, and two, we don't often get such a like population. You know what I mean? If we did the mass survey, because I think Jonathan already knows, well, I might have asked some social demographics. For the rest of you doing surveys, those social demographics are hugely important. One is one of the things that separates people, and even in nursing homes, people tend to aggregate according to social status. Isn't that amazing? Money. But anyway, so there are things you learn from this that then you can expand upon. I think that phenomenological studies are also have that added piece of, over the opening circle, I would ask Jonathan, how did really looking at this phenomenological study change you? Because our research will change us, and that's very important. So all the people who have talked today, and all the people who will talk, and all of you who already started, will probably have ways that your research will change you, in addition to the things you've found. So I'm going to put a shout out for how well this research project was done and how thoughtful it was, as the other, Kevin's and then Chris was her qualifying paper, so talking about a subject area and using that experientially. So everybody did a wonderful job today and have really come wonderful. So let's hand for everybody. And so now, we don't have a lot of time for a break, but after the welcoming, which shouldn't take too long, we go into opening circles, and then you can kind of break and get in your opening circle. So, I know somebody from the staff came in to be like, okay, get downstairs now. If we can really help them out that way, we can get started, and that'll go. Oh, thank you. And I think
We need to turn in the slips to you.
the slips can go up here in piles and get back to the people. Griff, there's some up here for you, and James, you'll take care of all this stuff. Thank you. Oh, let's give a hand out to James.
Thank you, James.
That makes a huge difference, having a dedicated person.
What's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, it's so nice to meet you. It's 12:30, still good for you? Yeah, it's fine. Just from the library. Although now we know what we look like. Yeah. Yeah. Nice looking. Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yes.
And congratulations on the decision.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a lot tougher than I would have imagined.
Well, that's good. It is gonna be awesome. It's just, moving is never easy, but,
And did you use all of their analytic software as well?
Trying to get on the way.